My name is Camilla. I am 72 years old, and I live in a small town in Ohio. After my husband passed away, I moved into my son Sebastian's house, hoping to find some comfort in being near family. What I found instead was a kind of silence that cut deeper than words ever could. The nights were long, the rooms felt borrowed, and I often wondered if my presence was seen more as a weight than as the love I thought I was offering. That night at dinner, the light over the table flickered just a little, and the air was heavy with the smell of meatloaf and overcooked peas. Jennifer's voice broke through the clinking of forks. "You eat, but don't help." Her words hung in the room, sharp and unyielding. Sebastian kept his eyes on his plate, chewing as if nothing had been said, and my grandson Liam froze, his young eyes darting between us with confusion. I felt the sting of the insult, but it was my son's silence that pierced me deeper than any words could. I did not defend myself. I did not remind them of my aching hands that no longer scrubbed floors as easily, or the back pain that made bending unbearable. I did not list the ways I still folded laundry, cooked when I could, or mended Liam's jacket when buttons came loose. Instead, I picked up the plates and carried them to the sink, letting my dignity show in my quiet service. It was not the first bitter thing I had swallowed in my life, and I knew how to hide the taste of a sorrow behind steady hands. As I rinsed dishes, I thought of the long years that stretched behind me. I remembered double shifts at the dry cleaners, the smell of chemicals that clung to my skin, the coins I saved so Sebastian could have school supplies. I remembered sitting in the back of the auditorium at his graduation because I gave the better seats to others, still cheering louder than anyone. I thought of my husband fading in his final illness and how I bathed him, fed him, held him through nights of pain so he could keep his dignity. I had given everything, and yet here I was, reduced to a line tossed across the dinner table. When the kitchen was clean, I slipped into the small room they gave me. It was once a storage space just big enough for a single bed and a narrow dresser. The ceiling fan clicked with every turn, a tired rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. I lay awake staring at the shadows on the ceiling. From the living room came the sound of laughter glasses clinking, the muffled voices of Sebastian and Jennifer. Their joy floated down the hall, while I lay still, feeling my worth sink further with every note of their laughter. Liam had gone to bed long ago, and I prayed he would not remember the tension that had filled the room earlier. I turned onto my side and pulled the thin blanket close, wishing for the warmth of my husband's hand that was no longer there. The house around me was full of life, yet I felt invisible inside it, like a ghost moving through rooms where my name no longer held meaning. That night, I realized something had shifted. My place in that home had shrunk to a corner, and my presence had become something they endured, not cherished. I closed my eyes, but sleep would not come. Instead, I lay awake listening to their laughter grow softer as the hours stretched on, and I felt my worth slipping away like water through open fingers. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness that told me I could not stay any longer. The words from the night before still echoed in the silence, and Sebastian's quiet avoidance hurt more than Jennifer's sharp tongue. I looked around the small room I had been given, no more than a converted storage space, and realized that if I remained, I would lose what little dignity I still carried. I decided to leave without anger, without confrontation, only with the kind of quiet resolve that comes when you finally know you no longer belong. I pulled out my old suitcase from under the bed, a faded blue bag with a worn handle that had seen better days. Into it, I placed a few dresses, my documents in a brown envelope, and the simple gold ring that my husband had slipped onto my finger more than 50 years earlier. I left behind everything else, even my favorite porcelain mug. On the kitchen table, I placed the house key beside a folded dish towel I had washed that morning, a small act of care in a place where care was no longer wanted. There would be no note, no explanation, only silence. The bus station smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. I climbed aboard with my suitcase moving slowly on aching knees and sat by the window. The town passed by in fragments, familiar streets I had walked for decades, now reduced to a blur. No one called after me, no one noticed my absence. I was only one old woman on a bus, headed nowhere in particular, swallowed up by the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road. I told myself I would be fine, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. The care home I found was modest, chosen more for its affordability than for comfort. The hallway walls were painted a dull beige, and the air carried a sharp mix of bleach and boiled vegetables. My room was narrow, barely enough space for a bed and a dresser. A window too small to frame the sky let in pale light that did little to lift the gloom. The sheets were clean, the staff polite, but it was a place that reminded you every day you had been put away rather than welcomed. I unpacked in silence, folding clothes into drawers that did not feel like mine. At meals, I sat among others who carried the same look of quiet defeat. There was Mrs. Turner, who hummed old hymns under her breath, and George, who stared at the floor as if searching for the years he had lost. We were a group of the forgotten, gathered not by choice but by circumstance. I tried to smile at them, but inside I felt hollow. The loneliness pressed down on me harder than any insult ever had. I had left my son, my grandson, the house I had built my life around, and yet no one came to ask why. That night, lying on the narrow bed with the smell of disinfectant clinging to the air, I held the gold ring in my palm. I wondered if I had truly become a burden, if Jennifer had been right all along. Then a thought stirred, faint but steady. What if they were wrong? My husband had always told me I was the backbone of our family, that my sacrifices had mattered. He had trusted his friend Henry with the most important papers when he became ill. My hand trembled as I reached for the phone on the nightstand. When Henry answered, his voice was older but still familiar, steady, in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in years. I asked if he remembered the deed to the house. The question hung in the air, like a fragile thread connecting me to a past I thought I had lost. I did not know what his answer would be, but in that moment I felt a flicker of hope. It was small, almost hidden under layers of sorrow, yet it was there, whispering that perhaps my story was not finished after all. Henry's office had not changed much since the days when my husband used to visit him for legal advice. The shelves still sagged under the weight of thick law books, and the air smelled faintly of dust and leather. I sat in a chair that creaked under me, my hands folded tightly in my lap, as if holding myself together. Henry looked older, his hair thinner, but his eyes carried the same steady kindness that once gave my husband comfort during the hardest years. He listened as I explained why I had called. My voice shook when I asked about the house deed, unsure if I even wanted the answer. Henry stood moving slowly to a heavy oak cabinet with brass handles that had dulled with time. He unlocked a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, handling it with the care of someone holding something sacred. The sound of paper sliding across the desk seemed louder than it should have been. He laid the folder before me and opened it. There, in clear type, was my name, written as the legal owner of the house since 1993. The deed carried my husband's signature notarized and filed his trembling handwriting proof of the decision he had made while he still had strength. My chest tightened, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. The house, I had been told, was not mine. The house where I had been treated like a guest had always belonged to me. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but they were not from sorrow. They came from a sudden rush of clarity, as if years of humiliation had just been wiped clean with a single sheet of paper. I thought of my husband, of his quiet promise that I would never be left without a place of my own. Even as his body weakened, he had thought of me, protecting me in a way I had almost forgotten. Henry leaned back and told me that the deed had been updated every year, that the records were airtight and untouchable. My fingers traced the edges of the page, the rough texture grounding me. For the first time in a long while, I felt steady. The insult from Jennifer, the silence from Sebastian no longer defined me. This paper did. I sat straighter in the chair and closed the folder. I did not raise my voice, nor did I imagine bursting back into their lives to wave it in their faces. That would have been too easy, too loud. Instead, I told Henry I wanted the house sold. Quietly, discreetly. Let them discover the truth, not from my mouth, but from the letter that would arrive in their mailbox. Henry nodded understanding without question. I left his office holding the folder against my chest like armor. Outside, the autumn air smelled of rain and fallen leaves, and for the first time in years, I felt taller. Not out of vengeance, but out of balance, restored. I was no longer just an old woman they tolerated. I was the rightful owner, and I would decide what came next. The sale of the house went through faster than I expected. Henry handled the paperwork quietly, just as I had asked. Within weeks, the money was wired into an account under my name, and with it came a strange stillness. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt ready to breathe for the first time in years. The money could have bought a cruise, a condo, or endless shopping bags, but none of those things mattered to me. I wanted something that would last longer than satisfaction. I searched until I found a modest 4-room home outside Cleveland. The roof sagged a little, the paint peeled, and the garden was overrun with weeds, but when I walked through its narrow halls, I saw a possibility. The wooden floors creaked with age, but they carried warmth. I signed the papers and felt as if I had claimed more than a house. I had claimed my right to begin again. The neighbors probably wondered why an old woman would take on such work, but for me, it was not work. It was purpose. Renovating the house became my daily rhythm. A young handyman named Tommy helped with repairs, but I scrubbed walls, painted trim, and planted flowers with my own hands. I wanted every corner to hold a touch of care. Soon, I opened the doors to others who needed a place like I once did. Helen was the first. She arrived with a single bag and eyes that carried years of rejection. Her daughter had told her to leave when she could no longer drive. At Haven House, she found a room with a window that faced the sunrise, and in the mornings she hummed as she watered herbs on the porch. Roland came next. He was a widower who loved to cook, and though his hands shook, he still made soups that filled the air with garlic and thyme. He laughed easily, a sound that spread through the house like music. Together, the three of us planted tomatoes in tubs, basil, in old flower pots, and mint that crept along the fence. On warm evenings, we sat on the porch as the sky turned gold, sipping tea while the world slowed around us. Word spread quietly, and soon 2 more elders joined us. A retired schoolteacher named B, who still corrected grammar with a wink, and Marion, who once owned a flower shop and coaxed roses back to bloom in the yard. Haven House became a patchwork of lives stitched together, each carrying scars, but finding comfort in being seen again. There were no chores demanded, no conditions to prove worth. Everyone gave what they could, and everything was enough. Our days carried a rhythm of simple joy. Breakfast lingered with a laughter, afternoons were filled with small projects, and nights ended with stories told over candlelight. We argued playfully about recipes, teased each other about habits, and celebrated small victories like the first ripe tomato or a chair finally fixed. The air was often filled with the sound of a Roland's chuckle or Helen's sharp remark softened by affection. In those moments, I realized I had not only rebuilt a house, but a sense of belonging I thought was lost forever. One evening, after we shared a meal of roasted chicken and fresh salad from our garden, I sat in my room with my leather journal open on the desk. The window glowed with the last light of day, and the air smelled faintly of basil. I wrote slowly, letting the words carry the weight of truth. They called me a burden, but now I am building a place where no one proves their worth to stay. I closed the journal and felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my life was no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what I chose to give. It was almost a year later when I saw Sebastian walk up the gravel path to Haven House. His shoulders were bent, his clothes hung loose, and his eyes carried the weight of nights spent without rest. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, his hands twisting together as if he were still a boy who had done something wrong. His voice broke when he said he was sorry. Jennifer had left him. He had lost the house, and he finally understood how deeply he had failed me. I listened without interrupting the hum of the ceiling fan filling the spaces between his words. When he looked at me with tears clinging to the edge of his lashes, I told him he remembered too late, but that growth was still possible. He nodded, unable to speak, and I reached for the small box beside my chair. From it, I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and slid it toward him. I told him this was the deed to his future. Live better. Love better. That is how you honor me. His hand trembled as he took it, holding it as if it carried more value than all the deeds and documents he had ever seen. He left quietly, and I did not follow him to the door. Some journeys must be taken alone, and his had only just begun. That evening, I carried a cup of tea out to the porch and settled into my favorite chair. The sun was low, casting a golden glow across the yard, where Helen and Bea were arguing over how to season the beans, while Roland laughed so hard he nearly dropped the pan. Their laughter rose into the air light, and free, carrying with it the proof that I had built something worth keeping. I sipped the tea and let the warmth settle in my chest. I thought of the long road that had brought me here, from the sharp insult at a dinner table to this place filled with voices that valued me. Sometimes leaving quietly is the loudest thing you can do. Respect, not repayment, is what every parent deserves. As the light faded and the porch filled with shadows, I knew I had chosen the life I was meant to live.